I want to ask you in a moment about things you learned from C.S. Lewis.
Mér langar að spyrja til smá stund það sem þú lærðir af C.S. Lewis.
But before I do that, I want to hear about some things you learned from your mother.
En áður að gera það, þá vil ég spyrja það sem þú lærðir af móður þinni.
I think what I learned most from my mother happened in those last few years.
Ég held ég hafa lært mest af móður minni þessi síðustu ár.
And it's very simple, really.
Og mjög einfalt.
No matter what happens, no matter what comes your way, never give up.
Sama hvað gerist, sama hverju mætir, aldrei gefast upp.
And never blame anybody but oneself.
Og aldrei kenna öðrum
I know she was looking towards heaven, but maybe she didn't give up for a while because she was looking towards C.S. Lewis.
Ég veit að hún var að horfa til himins en kannski tíma gafst hún ekki upp því hún var að horfa á C.S. Lewis.
I think at the very end of things, I think she began to realize that her pain was hurting Jack more than it was hurting her.
Ég held að undir lokin hafi hún séð að hennar sársauki særði Jack meira en hana.
And I think she was glad to go at the last few minutes.
Wow.
Og ég held að undir lokin hafi verið fegin að fá að fara.
I'm always impressed by some of these things that I've noticed as I've read about them, and I've read particularly A Grief Observed.
Og eftir,
They seem to have a deep love for each other.
Og eftir því sem ég lesið meira þau og sérstaklega ég les A Grief Observed að þá hef ég séð og það hefur haft áhrif á mig hvað þau virðast hafa djúpstæðan kærleika hvort til annars.
I also believe that she gave him 3.5 years of the best years of his life.
En ég trúi einnig að hún hefði gefið honum 3,5 bestu ár ævi hans.
You're not actually looking back far enough.
Go ahead.
They were married for 4 years.
4 years.
They delighted in each other's company for about 2 or 3 years before that. And I think the relationship didn't change just because they got married.
That's good.
Og ég held að þetta ekki horfa nú langt aftur. Þau voru gift í 4 ár en þau hefðu verið að eiga samskiptum 2 árum lengur.
I will correct my remarks every time I bring this up.
Og ég held að samband hefði ekki breyst og hefði gifst og þannig ég mun.
It's always good when the C.S. Lewis scholar could sit down with somebody who lived it.
Það alltaf svo gott þegar fræðimaðurinn C.S. Lewis getur sest með einhverjum sem var á staðnum.
Anyway, there you go. I think that he brought her joy.
Oh yes, of course.
Ég held að hann hefði fært henni gleði, já, sannlega.
She did indeed, but it was something that was inevitable. It was inevitable. There's no way that particular relationship could ever have been stopped by anything except death. And it didn't really stop when she was dead.
Þannig að ég held að það hafi verið óumflýjanlegt. Það var ekkert sem gat stöðvað þetta samband nema dauðinn sjálfur og jafnvel stöðvaði dauðinn það ekki alveg.
You have to remember it was only about 1.5 years till Jack died.
Yeah.
Og svo munið þetta var bara 1,5 ára án að Jack dó sjálfur.
And he willingly followed her.
Og hann fylgdi henni fús.
What are some of the things you learned from him living close, proximate?
Og hvað lærður af honum með því að lifa svona nálægt honum?
One of the first things I learned from Jack living in close proximity to him, after my mother died particularly, was you couldn't fool him.
Eitt af sem ég lærði af Jack sérstaklega fljótt eftir að mamma dó var að maður gat ekki blekkt hann.
Play that out.
Well, I used to get on my motorcycle and go to school in inverted commas. And usually I had a shotgun stuck in my jacket somewhere and was going poaching instead. Things like that. And I always assumed that Jack didn't know what I was doing.
Ég til dæmis fórstundum í skólan á mótuhjólinu mínu innan gæsalappa, var með haglabyssu eitthvað staðar falda og fór að veiða fyrir að fara í skólan og ég held að Jack vissi það ekki en ég held að hann alltaf vissi það.
But he was aware of the fact that I wasn't attending the school.
Hann var meðvitaður það að ég var ekki að sækja skólan.
And he very soon organized a different kind of school for me to go to.
Og mjög fljótlega eftir það þá tryði hann ég færi í annars konar skóla.
I was actually at a very good school theoretically.
Ég var reyndar svona í mjög góðum skóla.
It was Magdalen College School.
Magdalen College skólinn.
But the problem was that they didn't have the faintest clue how to handle me.
En vandi var þau ekki hugmynd hvernig það takast á við þig.
I inherited a certain degree of my mother's intelligence.
Ég fékk að vissu leyti gáfur frá móður minni.
And I used it to my desires rather than the school's.
Og notaði þær til að sinna mínum áhugamálum frekar en verkefnum skólans.
At that school, the prefects were allowed to beat the younger boys.
Og í þeim skóla þá máttu kennararnir berja yngri strákana.
And so they did when they had the opportunity, when you had done something or insulted a prefect.
Og það, sorry.
No, after you.
Ja, og það gerðu þeir ef maður gerði eitthvað rangt eða móðgæði þá.
They would take you into the prefect's room, make you bend over a chair and beat you with a stick.
Þeir fóru með í svona kennarastofu eða herbyggi og hérna létu beygja yfir stól og svo lömdu þeir með priki.
They did it to me only once, because when the guy had finished whacking me with a stick as I was bent over the chair, I asked if he was finished.
Og þetta var bara gert einu sinni því þegar búið var að berja mig með prikinn og spurði ég hvort hann væri búinn að ljúka sér af.
And there were several other prefects who were watching this performance.
Og það voru nokkrir aðrir sem að horfa á þetta.
And they realized that there was no expression on my face, or one of them did anyway.
Og þeir sáu það, ég voru ekki svipbrigði á andlitinu á mér.
He had the sense to leave.
Og hann hafði vitað að fara.
I picked up the chair and cleaned the room.
Ég tók upp stól og ég hreinsaði herbyggið.
I don't like being bullied, never did.
Mér líkar ekki að vera lagður í einelti, hef aldrei gert það.
So anyhow, I went off to a different school, a very different school, and did very well there.
Fór í allt öðruvísi skóla og gekk miklu betur þar.
But Lewis was wise to you when you were involved in these shenanigans.
Oh, yes.
And how did he treat you that caused you to have more respect for him?
Sann Lewis var meðvitaður hvað þú varst að gera ránt og hvað gerði hann til að þú myndir virða hann meira?
I never lacked, reverence for Jack, actually, rather more than just respect. I was ashamed of myself for what happened with that school. And Jack, I think, probably understood that. He never chastised me. He just told me I had to go to this other school, and off I went.
Já, það var ekki það með skorti virðingu fyrir Jack. Ég hafði alltaf mikla virðingu fyrir honum, en
he was there for you after your mother died.
He was always there for me.
Hann var til staðar fyrir eftir að móðin dó, hann var alltaf til staðar fyrir mig.
Before my mother died and afterwards.
Áður en að mamma mín dó og eftir að hann dó.
You can read Lewis all your life, and you won't get the perspective of how Lewis was as a father until you hear it here.
Við getum lesið eftir Lewis alla ævi okkar og við munum aldrei skilja hvernig hann var sem faðir nema með því að heyra það hér.
Being with Jack and as a young boy and as a growing boy was absolutely wonderful.
Að vera í kringu Jack sem að ungu drengur var algjörlega dásamlegt.
He would never lie to you.
Hann laug aldrei að manni.
I can remember one occasion he asked me what I was thinking because I'd been deep in thought for a while.
Einu sinni spurði mig hvað ég hef verið að hugsa því ég var djúpt hugsi.
And I said, well, I'm trying to figure out what my worst sin is.
Ég sagði, ég reyna að átta mig hver mín mesta synd.
And with a twinkle in his eye, he said, oh, that's easy. It's pride.
Og hann glott út í annað og segja, það nú auðvelt, stolt.
What I didn't realize, of course, was you could say that to any person on earth at any time and be absolutely accurate.
Það sem ég áttaði mig ekki á var að þú gæti sagt þetta hvaða mannski sem er á jörðinu og það haft alveg rétt fyrir þér.
He was a good man.
Hann var góður maður.
And a good father.
Og góður faðir.
So really it's difficult for me to go back and say all the things I did which he did in fact dislike many of the things I did.
Þannig að það er erfitt fyrir mig að fara yfir allt það sem ég gerði og ég veit að honum mislíkaði.
But I'd lost my father and then my mother, and I really had sort of given up on loving people for a while.
Ég hafði mist föður minn og síðan móður minna og ég hafði eiginlega gefist upp á því að elska fólk.
And of course Jack followed them quite closely.
Og Jack fylgdi alltaf í kjölfar á þeim.
So that left me sort of swinging high and dry in the middle of nowhere and nothing.
Og það skildi mig algjörlega eftir allslausan í lausu lofti.
And that didn't change until I met a young girl at a railway station in Somerset.
En það breyttist ekki fyrir ég hitti unga konu á járnbrautastöð í Somerset.
I assume that's Mary.
Oh yes, absolutely.
And didn't you know the first time you saw her that you were going to marry her?
Yes.
Það var vantilega Mary konaðin og hún vissi strax að þið myndi giftast, já.
And how long did it take before she was convinced?
About 3 years.
Og hvað tók langan tíma þannig að hún var sannfærð? Það var 3 ár.
And it cost me every single penny I had in the entire world.
Og það kostaði mig einhvern einasta eyri sem ég átti í heiminum.
But it was one of those things I knew from childhood, the little girl I wanted to meet and play with, because I had no playmates when I was a child, because my brother was insane, basically, and dangerous. And I imagined this little girl I wanted to play with and what she'd look like and what she'd behave like.
Og ég lék mér aldrei við aðra vegna þess að eldri bróðir minn hann hagaði sér svo illa að lékur sér ekki við mig, en ég ímyndaði mér hvers konar stúlku ég vildi leika mig við.
And that started when I was about 5 years old, I think.
Og
went on right until we parted company. My brother and myself parted company.
Og það byrjaði þegar ég var svona 5 ára og hélt áfram þar til að leiðir okkar skildu, bróður mín og mín.
But this image in my mind of the sort of little girl I wanted to play with and talk to and so forth grew as I grew older.
En þessi ímyndari stúlku sem ég vildi leika mig við og tala við, að hún óx með mér.
And I was living at that time with my mother's best friend in Oxfordshire, a lady by the name of Jean Wakeman.
Og ég bjóð þarna með vinkonu móður minnar, Jean Wakeman hét hún.
And she lived with a former World War I fighter pilot and his elderly wife.
Og hún bjó ásamt fyrirverandi flugmanni í fyrir heimsstyrjöldinni og konu hans.
Francis Jones was a wonderful man too. He had been a fighter pilot in the First World War, and he'd crashed a few aircraft and he'd been shot a bit and so forth. But he was a wonderful man and a very kindly man, and he was very good to me.
Og Francis Jones var líka dásamlegur maður, hafði verið flugumari fyrir heimsstyrjöldinni, brotlent nokkrum flugvélum, verið skotinn og ýmislegt, en hann var góður maður og góður við mig.
But what was missing from my life still was any feminine people.
En þessi vantaði líf mitt var einhver svona kvenleg nærvera.
Everyone else was too old to be that sort of interested in me, I mean, in helping me.
Og allir aðrir kringum mig voru bara einhvern veginn gamlir og gátu ekki verið mér innan handar.
But when I went down to this farm in Somerset,
Svo fór ég á þennan bóndabæ þarna í Somerset
to work as a sort of student farmer.
og fór að vinna þar eins og lærlingur.
I still had this image in my mind of the young woman I wanted to meet.
Þá var ég enn með þessa ímynd í hugum mínum af konunni sem ég vildi hitta.
And Harry Mallet, who was the son of the owners, Sir Edward Mallet and Lady Mallet, they sort of took me on board and were very, very helpful.
Og fjölskylda sem ég fór til, þau bara tóku mig borð og höfðu mig með sér.
And that particular time we were sent down to, Lady Mallet came to the breakfast room one morning and waved a piece of paper and said, "Oh, you'll love this, Doug, Mary's coming to stay."
Og einn daginn það kemur húsfrúin niður og veifar með og segir, "Heyrðu, þið verið hrifin þessu, Mary að koma í heimsókn."
So I said, "Well, who's Mary?"
Ég segi, "Hver Mary?"
And she said, "Well, she's our niece, she's from Tasmania."
Hún frænka okkar frá Tasmaníu.
I hadn't even heard of Tasmania at that stage.
Þarna hafði ég aldrei heyrt Tasmaníu.
So I asked how old she was, and she said she's 20, and I said, "Well, that's too old for me." And Harry piped up and said, "Oh no, anything with trousers on is good enough for Mary." I never let him forget it.
Ég spurði hvað hún gömul eða tvítug, já, hún var gömul fyrir mig og þá svaraði Harry, nei, hver sem í buxum hentar henni vel.
Well, Mary was coming to stay with a good friend of hers, another nurse. They were both nurses in St. Thomas's Hospital at the time.
Og Mary var að koma á vinkonu síni sem einn var hjúkrunarkona.
And so we were sent to Taunton, where the big railway station was, to collect these two from the train and bring them back.
Við vorum sendið til Taunton, þar sem að stóra járnbrautarleststöðin var til að sækja þær tvær.
And eventually the train drew into the station with a roar. It was a steam train back in those days. Probably most of you here don't know what steam trains were or are, but they were before electric and before everything else trains.
Og með miklum látum kemur lestin inn á stöðina, þetta gömul gufulest.
And through the steam and the smoke that was coming out of the engine and so forth, eventually people started to get off the train, and hundreds of people got off that train.
Og í gegnum reykinn og gufuna frá lestinni byrjaði fólk að koma út úr lestinni.
And then I saw a girl step down from the train.
Og svo sá ég stúlku stíga út úr lestinni.
And I turned to Harry immediately.
Og ég sneri mig strax að Harry.
And I said, "Harry, you see that girl over there?"
Og ég sagði, Harry, sér þessa stúlku?
And he said, "Which one? There's dozens of them."
Hverja þeirra? Það eru fleiri tugir.
And I said, "The blonde one over there."
Þessi þarna ljósharða.
He said, "Yes, what about her?"
Hann sagði, já, hvað með hana?
And I said, "That's the girl I'm going to marry."
Ég sagði, þetta stúlka sem ég ætla að giftast.
And he said, "Don't be stupid, that's my cousin."
Hann sagði, láttu ekki svo kjánið, þetta er frænka mín.
It took me 3 years, and as I said, every cent I had in the world to persuade her that it was a good idea, and 3 proposals, please note.
Og það tók mig 3 ár, alla peningana mína og 3 bónorð til að sannfæra hana þetta að vera góð hugmynd.
She never turned me down, but she didn't answer.
Hún hafnaði mér aldrei, hún bara svaraði ekki.
She just kissed me gently and went about whatever she was doing.
Hún bara kyssti mig.
Eventually,
En að lokum,
she said yes.
Sagði, já.
And we've been married for 54 years now, so it must have been a reasonably good idea.
Þannig að við höfum verið gift í 54 ára, þannig að hlýtur að hafa verið sæmilega óbilið hugmynd.
There's a little bit about Isaac when Rebekah was brought to him. Mm-hmm. And after the death of his mother, he was comforted by the coming of Rebekah.
Það eitthvað eins og við sögun eins og þegar Ísak hitti Rebekku og eftir dauða móður hans að þá var huggun í komu Rebekku í líf hans.
And you had just made that observation after all these losses, the thing that helped you through it most was the coming of Mary.
Og þú bentir á það eftir öll þessi áföll og það sem hjálpaði mest var þegar María kom í lífið þitt.
For a while there was a difficulty in my heart because I wondered how long it would take for her to die.
Og lengi þá velti ég fyrir mér eftir við byrjuðum saman hvenær hún myndi deyja.
Everybody else had left.
Allir aðrir voru farnir.
So I was a little worried about that, but as I say, 54 years isn't bad.
Ég hafði smá ágjörð því, en 54 ár ekki slæmt.
How many children, Doug?
Hvað mörg börn?
We have 5 children.
Við höfum 5 börn.
And 11 grandchildren.
11 barnabörn.
So we're quite happy about that.
Við erum mjög ánægð með það.
But getting back to Jack, I think it's interesting because I think if he were alive today, he would be gleeful over the marriage, myself and Marion, and the raising of our children.
He wouldn't believe it?
No, he would be gleeful about it. He would be very pleased that this had worked for us.
Ég held ef að Jack var á lífi í dag, þá hann yfir sig hrifinn af hjónabandi mínu og Mary og börnunum okkar.
What's interesting to me about that, though, too, you said in some ways your childhood was a bit lonely. And in Lewis's life, his having children at such proximity as you boys, when you came into his life, was also something that was vacuous. How is it that a man who hadn't had children could connect with you so deeply and could, at some level, fill that void for you? What was it about him? What quality?
Já, þú talar það þegar þú varst í þinni barnæsku hafðir upplifað einmanaleika og vantað leikfélaga og einnig Lewis að hafa verið einmanaleiki í honum. Hvernig gat maður sem aldrei hafði sjálfur átt börn náði að tengjast þér svona vel og tengjast börnum svona vel?
I think initially it started with charity.
Ég held að það byrjaði á kærleika.
And Jack knew that I was in difficulties of all sorts of kinds when we first went there from the very first moment that we arrived at the kilns.
Ég held að Jack hafi vitað frá byrjunni ég átti alls konar erfiðleikum.
And for him, the easiest and best thing to do would be to move in as best he could and help me as much as he could, and he did.
Og fyrir honum var það besta sem hann gat gert að komast þess nálægt mér hann gat og hjálpa mér eins mikið hann gat og það gerði hann.
He tried his very best with my brother as well, but my brother shunned the whole idea.
Hann reyndi sitt besta með bróður minn líka, en bróður minn algjörlega hristi það hugmynd af sér.
Even when I was at my worst things and was running away from school and poaching people's pheasants and all that sort of thing.
Og jafnvel upp versta þegar ég var að skrópa í skólanum og skjóta fasana fólks og annað.
Jack never chastised me or criticized me in any way for what I was doing. I think he fully realized that this was my only way of fighting the grief that I suffered from.
Sure.
Og þá aldrei skammaði mig eða braut mig niður, heldur hann átt að segja að þetta var eina leið mín til að fá útrás fyrir sorgina.
He was a very, very wise man in many ways. He often said that he was very poor with children, very bad with children.
Hann var mjög vitur maður. Hann sagðist að það var verið lélegur með börnum.
But he did himself a disservice because in fact he was very good with children. He just didn't realize he was being very good with children.
Það var ekki sagt að hann var mjög góður með börnum, hann bara áttaði sig ekki á því.
I've heard that one of his strengths was that he would meet a child and treat the child as if they were a human being, full human being with dignity.
Ég hef heyrt að eitt styrkleiki sem hafi verið þegar hann mætti barnið þá koma fram við það sem mannesku með fulla reisn.
He did exactly that, but also so did Warnie to a great extent. So I never felt that I was outside of the circle of their conversations. I was included in everything.
Yeah.
Because they didn't sort of treat me as a child. They treated me as a small but intelligent human being who still had a lot to learn.
Og hann sannlega gerði það. Allar mín reynsla á honum, þá var mér aldrei haldið utan við samtöl. Ég var alltaf meðvitaður og inn í öllu sem var að gerast. Komið fram við mig eins og sannlega ég var minni manneskja en fyllilega manneskja.
In healthy relationships, he writes in that essay membership that they would be inclusive, not exclusive.
Og hann talar það í bók sinni að heilbrigð sambönd að þau bjóða fólki inn en halda því ekki frá.
That would be very typical of him, with children as well as with grown-ups. In fact, even with dogs. He was very fond of the dogs that we had there, and he included them in everything he did, as he did me.
Og þannig var hann með bæði mannfólk og börn og með þessi hundan okkar að allir fengu þátttökurétt, fengu að vera með.
It's interesting too that when your mother died, how much empathy they must have had for you since they had both been through the similar experience.
Og merkir þetta eins og þegar mamma þín deyr að þeir hljóta að hafa haft mikla svona
sorry. Warnie, unfortunately, of course, was deeply wounded by my mother's death. She was the sister he'd longed for all his life and never had till she turned up, and then she only lasted about 4 years. So he was grieving as heavily as Jack was, and he turned to alcohol to soothe that. So he was sort of blotto for the next 6 weeks.
Já, og þeir hefðu haft samkennur því þeir eru upplifað sama, þá sann ég að dauðsfall móður hafði áhrif á báða, líka bróður Lewis, því að hún hafði verið systirinn sem hann hafði alltaf þráð og þetta fekk það mikið á hann sneri sér að áfengi og hann var bara blautur næstu árin.
Jack and I shared our grief.
Ég og Jack deildum sorg okkar.
We didn't hide it from each other at all.
Við földum en ekki hvor fyrir öðrum.
And I think that was probably the most valuable thing to me, that he would share his grief with me and I with him. Because had he ignored me or had he turned me away at that time, I would have been completely and utterly lost.
Ég held að það sem sennilega dýrmætast að hann deildi sorg sinni með mér og ég með honum, því ef hann hefði hunsað mig eða ítt mér í burtu þá hefði ég verið algjörlega týndur.
There are many kinds of charity. He was exhibiting one of the most powerful, most valuable and just most beautiful forms of it.
Kærleikurinn á sér margar myndir og það sem hann sýndi mér var sennilega fallegasta og sterkasta útgáfan.
When I went to the next school I went to after this Oxford school, I started to do much better. I had good teachers who knew what they were doing.
Og í næsta skóla sem ég fór í þá gekk mér miklu betur, ég var með góða kennara sem vissu hvað þeir voru að gera.
And I passed all the exams I needed to pass to get into the agricultural college.
Og ég stóðst öll próf sem ég þurfti til að komast inn í bændaskólan.
In fact, there was an English literature exam that I did for fun more than anything else.
Og svo var próf í enskum bókmenntum sem ég gerði meira gamni en nokkuð annað.
And you had to choose a book that you were going to write a piece about afterwards.
Og þú þurftir að velja bók til að skrifa ritgerðum.
And I chose to write a story about a poem that was presented to me. I'm trying to remember the name of the darn thing. It was Byron. It was Lord Byron's Vision of Judgment.
Og ég ákvað að skrifa sögu út frá ljóði eftir Lord Byron og sýn hans dómsdag.
And the only way I could think of really explaining it, because the question was, do you think Byron's Vision of Judgment is a good satire? If so, why? And if not, please explain.
Og spurningi var að finnst þér að ljóð Byrons dómsdag sé góð satíra eða ekki, vinsalegast útskýrðu.
So I wrote a satire of Lord Byron's Vision of Judgment.
Hann ég skrifaði eins og satíru eða háðsleikrit sýn Byrons á dómstegi.
And the examination invigilator who was there, one of the teachers, actually started reading it because I handed it in after 3 hours and it was a 6-hour exam. He started to read it and he had to leave the room because he couldn't stop laughing.
Og prófdómarinn sem að las hana, því við höfum 6 klukkutíma en ég skila eftir 3, hann fór að lesa og þurfti að fara á herbygginu, hann hló svo mikið.
So I got my A-level exam in English literature just by the one satire that I wrote out of sheer devilment.
Og þannig náði ég samrættu prófi í bókmenntum með því að skrifa hásglósur eða hásleikrit út frá ljóði Byrons.
When I explained it to Jack, he was absolutely thrilled.
Og þegar ég sagði Jack var á þessu, þá var hann himinlifandi.
Unfortunately, he died a very short while later.
Því miður dó hann skömmu síðar.
Did your living with him, did any of his literary interests rub off on you? Did you find yourself going to some of the authors that he was reading?
Almost all of them, yes.
Tell us about that.
Me and books.
Og það búa með honum, bókmennta áhugi hans að hann áhrif á þig, leitaður í sömu höfund og hann svaraði já svo sannarlega.
Myself and books are kind of magnetic. If there's a book around, I'll be reading it for very much longer if I've got the time. I'm much shorter of time now than I used to be. I'm too busy with other things. But I used to read, and still do read, everything I can get my hands on.
Bækur hafa mikið aðdráttur afl á mig. Ef það bók í grendinni þá ég farin að lesa eftir smá stund og í dag miklu hraðar en áður fyrr, en ég les mjög mikið og allt sem ég kem höndum yfir.
So I've read, I started my reading career reading the Encyclopedia Britannica.
Ég byrjaði að lesa alfræðiorðabók.
And this was in a prep school, small, when I was very small.
Þarna var ég bara drengur.
They did have a library, it was a rotten school, but they did have a good library there, which it was good because it had some interesting books, but also because it had the Encyclopedia Britannica.
Og það var gott bókasafn, það voru ýmsar ágætar bækur en líka því það áttu þessa alfræðiorðabók.
When I'd read all the good fiction in the library, I read the Encyclopedia Britannica. And when I finished it, I started again and read it again.
Wow. Og þegar ég var búinn með allar góðu skáldsögurnar, þá las ég alfræðiorðabókina og þegar ég búinn þá las ég hann aftur.
And some of that stuff is still up there, locked away.
Og sumt af því sem ég las þar ennþá upp í kollinum.
So, Lewis encouraged you a little bit because didn't he have a book account at Blackwell's bookstore?
Og Lewis hvatti svo, var hann ekki með reikning í bókabúð Blackwell?
He did, but I didn't use it. My brother was the guy who took advantage of that. And yet he never learned much in his life. But I just went to the bookshelves. The whole house was full of bookshelves.
Það var með slíka reikninga, ég notfærði mér það aldrei, það var meira bróðir mér en samt lærði hann ekki mikið á lífsleiðinni. Ég fór bara í bókahillurnar heima, húsið var fullt af bókum.
At the end of Lewis Close, when you turn left onto Kilns Lane, that first house you would come to, that was the library of Headington, wasn't it at that time?
I don't think so.
No?
No, I don't remember where the library was. I just didn't go there. I had plenty of books at home. But Lewis Close didn't exist in those days.
Say it again?
Lewis Close did not exist in those days.
What did they call it?
There was no road there.
It was just the
It was our personal private
driveway.
drive. Yeah.
Já, þeir tala hvar bókasafnið var og nefna vegi sem hefði ekki nöfn þá og núna nefndi eftir Lewis en hann vissi aldrei hvað bókasafnið var því það var svo mikið af bókum á heimilinu.